Jono, how would you actually introduce our next guest? Because you met him as a cadet on the hustings when you were running the academy, and he's elevated himself over the last few years to what level?
He's gone to AFL is Cal Twomey, I think. AFL.com is Cal Twomey, not from anymore. And that's true, because you're right. Cal and I have known each other for quite some time now, and Cal was part of the AFL Academy when we used to take, the best 30 kids from Australia to 4 camps, but in particular the one overseas to the USA. And Cal played it really well in terms of, gaining the trust of the youngsters and working through the system in a really sort of respectful way. And I think that's why now, we're seeing Cal break the stories that he is, because of the respect that he's been able to build over probably 8 or 9 year period of grinding out some hard yards to get to the level that we see today. Now, that's it, Cal. I'm not talking positive anymore.
Well, we might as well welcome him to the program. Cal, great to have you on board.
Good evening, Jared, and thanks, John, for the kind words. Yeah, we did go on a few of those trips, a couple to Europe, back in some far-out places of Italy, I think they were, where the AIS was, and then a few trips to America as well. We got to find a way somehow to get those trips back.
That's it.
They were good times. But obviously, they were great for the kids as well, weren't they? And as you say, getting to know these players before they hit the limelight later in their draft years, respectively.
It's been a really interesting off-season, and we'll get to all matters football. But can I talk about something or ask your views on an issue that is still probably the biggest topic in football that's not being discussed? I mean, everybody is of the view that Gill McLachlan is going to resign at the end of this year or early next year, but is it reasonable to say there's a large chance that he may actually sign up for the entirety of next year?
For the entirety of next year, that would be a change of
it'd
plan,
be a change, yeah.
Well, he's still got a lot of items to go on the tick-off list, doesn't he? And when he first announced that he was going to be seeing 2022 as his last season, there was clearly the Tasmania decision, which still has some way to go before a resolution's reached there. There was the collective bargaining agreement too. I don't think he wanted to leave that hanging for his successor. And now the Hawthorn investigation as well has, I think, probably altered, from the outside looking in, altered how that's going to play out in terms of the timing-wise of it.
Yeah, well, he's already said he didn't feel like he should desert the chair with that particular case running. He thought he needed to own that and see that through. But who knows how long that is going to take. But it does feel, Jono, as if, I mean, I don't think we would like to see this meander along. It'd be good, I think, at some stage if Gill makes his mind up to give us some sort of timeline as to, okay, are you in for the season? Let's call it September next year.
I think there's 3 weeks up his sleeve. In terms of that, the players will start coming back. The competition, the men's competition starts to bubble away again with pre-seasons and starting, and the draft coming up as well, which is, I think, important. Around that time, I think, is when a concrete decision needs to be made from Gill to let us all know whether he's going to take on that role going forward for the next 12 months or whether he is going to step away within 6 or whether he's just stepping away completely at the end of the year.
And I guess the other part of that too is the AFLW Grand Final will be on the weekend off the draft as well. So that has been a conclusion to that season too. So we always said at the end of the season, there's been 2 seasons that there's been a little bit of leg room for him there to move around with. But certainly a decision is coming, you'd think. Yeah,
and I think if he's going to do it, he'd have to probably have some strict guidelines as to personal space, et cetera, because of anybody in football, he's had a hell of a commitment since the onset of the pandemic, and he would have been looking at the finishing line for a long time.
Yeah, that's right. And this Hawthorn investigation has popped up, I wouldn't say out of nowhere, but certainly thrown an extra element into this back half of the season, coming in grand final week as it did. He was preparing, and the AFL was preparing for this grand final to be the first one back at the MCG in 3 years and all these types of things. So that has added an extra caveat to what lays ahead.
Okay, let's get down to business. We've got the draft coming up on November 28, 29. You normally nail the first 35 picks. Who's going where?
Have you put your list out yet, Cal?
I've put my rankings out, but it's a little bit different to my fan draft. That's coming a little bit down the track once I made a few more calls.
So what are the known names? Cadman goes to the Giants, so we can take that. Is that a good decision for North to give up their number 1 pick?
I like that mega deal from all parties, and that's easy to say in hindsight. But even at the time, I thought, well, all these parties, and that's West Coast, the Giants, North Melbourne, Port Adelaide, they all got what they wanted out of that deal. Yep. It was a deal that saw these big objectives met. Port Adelaide got their man or their men in Junior Rioli and Jason Horne-Francis. West Coast doubled up at the top of the draft with pick 8 and pick 12. The Giants move up to pick 1. They are there to be able to grab a player who's not got the go-home factor as much as other prospects at the top of the pool. And then the Roos, I thought, were able to double up in the first 3. And they've got a handful of players who they rate pretty equally. And clearly you look at it and you think, well, Aaron Cadman couldn't have been a part of that if you through process of elimination. So they're still going to get 2 of their top 3 players. And there's some really good players at the top end too. So I thought all of those clubs, through the decision essentially of Jason Horne-Francis to seek the trade from North Melbourne to Port Adelaide, he spurred this big deal into action, and I thought all of them did pretty well.
Off the back of that, do you think, and clubs do look beyond just this year in particular, so with North Melbourne, do you think they've got their eye on that potential key next year, which they may get pick 1 or 2 again, depending on obviously where they finish, and everyone's sort of anticipating that they will be another development year for the Kangaroos, especially with the young talent they'll bring in and some of the growth within their own that we saw a little bit of this year that you hope will go to another step next year. But how far forward, and is there that little key that we're all missing potentially for next year?
Not as much of a key position player for next year as such, but next year's draft does look ultra exciting. Like, we're sniffing a super draft for next year.
There you go.
There's elements of it there already. And part of that has been that we've actually seen the 17-year-olds play this year. We haven't seen that for 2 years. So there's a couple of guys, and Zane Dersma is one of them, who's a 190 centimetre tall, I guess you'd call him, and he could be in that mix. North Melbourne, as part of this deal as well, have 2 first-round picks next year. They've got their own and Port Adelaide's. And then there's a kid called Harley Reid, who everybody's talking about. There's already a bit of a slogan, concede for Reid, finish last and pick up Harley Reid next year. But look, he's fantastic. So he's not a key forward. He's a midfield Dustin Martin type of player, but you have to have an eye on the future. And for them to double up, have 2 first-rounders this year, 2 next year, creates a good spot for them.
So give me your earliest year that the Kangaroos, based on what they've picked up this year, what they're going to pick up next year, and you can tell us who you think the Kangaroos will get this year. You had another 4 top 10 picks that side. What's the earliest you think that Clarko can look at challenging for finals?
What about 222 this year, 23 next year, grabbing a couple more? It's 225, isn't it? I think. And throughout that process too, John, you're going to be starting to attract better players who want to come in as free agents and trades. They already did that this year, picking up Griffin Logan, Darcy Tucker, basically for free. They got those players via the AFL's assistance package. So that was a good move from them. Who do I think they'll take this year? Well, they've got 2 and 3. We talk about Cadman at 1. I think Harry Shields was a very strong chance to be there. Kicked 49 goals this year. That's a really good draft season across his whole year. 49 goals. And then I think one of the midfielders is right in the mix there. And George Wardlaw is the favourite at the moment, inside midfielder. He might be there, Jason Horne-Francis. He's been injured the second half of the season through a few hamstring injuries that he had, 1, 2, 3. But we didn't see that much of him. If he played all year, the big games that he played with and against Will Ashcroft, he was best on ground in both of them.
There you go. So I reckon North Melbourne are a fascinating build here because you've got what they will pick up this year, maybe a high half forward turn into a pinch hit through the midfield with an inside mid next year. 3 first rounders, potentially could be a few more. Who knows how it might be a couple less depending on what they do with trades and bits and pieces. That'll play out. But the growth of Davies Uniacke this year was super impressive. All of a sudden he's broken 25 disposals. He looked classy, broke out of the front of the contest. I think the way the game opened up really helped Davies Uniacke in terms of his own development as a player. And we all talk about Jai Simpkin, of course, and what he can produce. So all of a sudden they will have over the next 3 years 4 or 5 key mids that should develop together for a long period of time. And that's the great starting point for myself in terms of then what they can then produce on the outside of those in terms of, your half-backers, your runners, your wingers, and your half-forwards to complement.
Yeah, and they've still got a lot of confidence in a guy that we haven't seen too much of yet, and that's Will Phillips, who was pick 3 in the 2020 draft. And he's had such a bad run since he's got to North Melbourne. There was injury, and then this year he missed most of the year, wiped out with glandular fever, unfortunately. So he's barely been cited at AFL level, but he picked it number 3 for a reason, and later that draft as well, first-round pick in Tom Powell. So there's some players there to work through the midfield group.
Jono's got all the numbers. Who's got the best draft hand?
The best draft hand, I mean, I look at the Giants and say that's the best draft hand in it, probably.
That's in perpetuity, isn't it?
It is.
Every year they've got it?
It is. Pick 1, they've got pick 1, pick 15, pick 18 and pick 19. So that's 4 inside the top 20. That's a pretty good hand. And there might still be some movement there. There might be the opportunity for them to package a couple up move up the board.
Do you think the Giants will ever get to that point where they'll become a stable club, where they'll be able to, I suppose, like Geelong in some ways, keep their players from a salary cap point of view, that they won't be under that pressure, so that stars are consistently leaving every year on year? One or two stars within that group are out the door because of pressure from a salary cap point of view.
I think to some degree that's been almost part of the plan in their opening years, that they're going to have to shed a player here or there, and they got so many early picks to start with. But you'd think that at this point in their evolution, they'd be ready to stop that sort of process. But this felt like a clean the sort of bill trade period for them. They moved out some players. One was under contract in Jacob Hopper, so that they picked up some nice picks for the next 2 years. And they cleared the decks in terms of their salary cap too. So they're in a much better position salary cap-wise. I don't think they'll be affording the $400,000, $500,000 second year or second contracts that have become the norm. I think that'll be a bit of a stake in the ground. That doesn't happen anymore.
Has to happen to the Suns as well. I mean, I think, are still signing some players on too much money that are probably not up to that sort of level. But I mean, unless the AFL are going to reintroduce Kohler, and that's probably 10-1 at this stage, they just have to cut their cloth.
And we saw them do that. And I think it's credit to them. They made some big decisions this trade period where I said, no, this is the time when we have to cut this back. And Jack Bowes is being paid a back-ended $800,000 over the next 2 years. This is the time to cut that back and move out the pick and create a market that way and do that deal. But in the meantime, right the ship in terms of what your salary cap looks like, because at some point you're going to be a club who players want to go to as a free agent. And that's not far away, I don't think, for Gold Coast, because the lifestyle is attractive. And we've seen that at Brisbane. Brisbane were a basket case 6 or 7 years ago. Now the only players who go there are non-Queenslanders.
Yeah, well, they drafted McCluggage and Berry together, mates, and that sort of started to change the dynamic. Do you think clubs are sitting there and going, thank you, Geelong? Because the whole story out of Geelong is in terms of what we're talking about, the way the stars that they've got in that lineup, but how they're managing the salary cap within that. Now they've won a premiership. So now the Giants can sort of say, well, look at the way Geelong's built. Now, if you want to be a part of our club and we know we can be successful with the stars that we've got, well, hang on, this is the way we do it from this point. So is that what you mean with the stake in the ground?
I think there's one part, thank you, Geelong, the other part's stuff you, Geelong, because you're so good at it. And your players want to get paid less, and they're comfortable with this sort of ocean view type of pool, home, or necessarily. That's the ultimate factory, isn't it? And then, of course, this club wins the premiership, and then they bring in Ollie Henry, who's a top 20 pick 2 years ago. Tanner Bruin is a top 20
pick 7.
And pick 7. So the rich get richer, but that's a culture thing, isn't it?
Yeah, but they do. The rich get richer, but it's smart administration. So
it is too.
Exactly, because they're playing within the rules of what is presented.
I think
they're just doing it better than everybody else.
I think clubs are just frustrated with the Bowes one because they didn't get in first or didn't make that move quick enough or whatever it was, and they weren't able to sell it.
The Bowes one was evident 6 months ago. When, at the start of the year when he was playing and then he didn't play and did not get a game.
Playing off halfback.
He was the Brody of 12 months ago. Will Brody goes to Fremantle and dominates the midfield because he's a top talent.
Yeah.
And given some freedom and an environment where he was able to then, I suppose, feel comfortable in, Bowes was exactly the same. And obviously we knew Jack from his academy days. So we always revert back to that.
Yeah.
Top-end talent, top 30 in the country. This kid can play. Now this young man, he can certainly play. How can we recapture that as a footy club? He'd be the first one I'd be knocking on the door of.
Yeah, and he had some injuries this year as well with his shoulder and just didn't get going. Played some VFL late in the year, but that's good scouting, isn't it? And good recruiting as well,
right.
From opposition clubs.
Just going back to the Giants, so they are a one-off in many respects, or maybe it's one of two. I mean, the Suns don't draw big crowds, but I think it's impossible to compare or expect the Giants to come up with exactly the same formula as Geelong or some of the other key clubs, given that there are some structural things that they just can't change at the present time. They need to reset, they need to rebuild, get some people watching their game and build that club for weekends as well as the weekdays. I mean, during the week, they're clearly a pretty good operation. They've been up the top for a fair period of time. They've defied gravity at various stages. They're now looking to have a couple of years outside the 8. But unless you get some people watching the game, you're always going to be susceptible to the big clubs coming and saying, come and do what Tom Lynch did. Come and do what Jeremy Cameron has done.
Exactly, and Tim Taranto and Jacob Hopper are evidence of that. To be honest, I thought Jacob Hopper was probably always going to end his career somewhere else in Victoria. I always felt there was a lure for him to come back home.
Yep.
And in the end, from a salary point of view, the Giants were nowhere near to be able to match what Tim Taranto was paid as well. So there is that unique factor to what they've got. They've also got a very unique salary cap model, don't they, too? It's like the Millionaires Club at the top and then the other
Well, that's got to be
guys.
broken down. I mean, that's the thing that maybe you had to pay that to keep them at the stage, but it's, maybe that was their biggest mistake. You should have let one go.
And in saying that, in terms of star factor, you got to prioritise your stars as well. So in terms of star factor and getting an audience and crowd to your game, you got to pick the right ones.
Now, Cal Thomas texted in, have you heard any potential new homes for some talented DFA? Delisted free agents out in the market, Rowe, Stocker, Stack, Brown. Anything going on with those guys?
So delisted free agency window opens tomorrow for about a week. Reporter on afl.com.au. There are clubs who are going to use more rookie picks to pick up their experienced players instead of delisted free agency picks, mainly because rookie picks obviously are cheaper, but you can find a rookie spot rather than assign a primary spot to these DFAs. So there's a couple. Port Adelaide will sign Francis Evans in the next couple of days. That's been known for a while. He's the Cats forward.
I think it's come through this afternoon.
I think that'll happen. So Jake Stein as well from the Giants has been delisted there. Has got some interest from Gold Coast as a rookie option as well. I think Liam Shields is back in the mix for a potential spot at North Melbourne. So
Really?
There was some interest in him while Alistair Clarkson was appointed, and around that time.
Not surprised about that. I interviewed him, I reckon, 10 years ago, and he was regarded and introduced as the next captain of Hawthorn.
It was similar to what Melbourne did when they were struggling. They got a good mate of mine, Daniel Cross, just to come along, professionalism, stability, calmness, and just a work ethic that enabled some of the youngsters to start pushing behind.
Yeah, so I think that's an option now, but it would be through the rookie draft where they've got a number of rookie picks. They've actually just opened up another rookie spot today in the delisting of Jared Pollock with a year to go on his lucrative deal, and that obviously is a pit trade several years ago that hasn't worked out, and now he's been cut with a year to go. So they've opened up those spots, and that's where he'd come into contention. But I don't think there's going to be heaps of DFA movement with the guys you mentioned. Liam Stocker, the Brown boys, still in a bit of limbo.
Narkle?
Has some interest out there. But
He should.
He should. But again, he might be one of these ones that has to wait a little bit until the rookie draft, see what clubs pick up through the national draft and how many spots they have.
See, I like the fact that Narkle has trained with Dangerfield, Selwood, Duncan, and look, he hasn't been able to push them out of a side because of the level that they're at. And Narkle needs to work on some aspects of his game and fitness and things like that. But around the contest in particular, he's very strong and powerful. So the fact that would trigger my interest a lot, the fact of who he's done all his training with.
Yep.
And the fact that if we can just get him a little bit fitter, potentially with a new home, a new mental approach for a player of his caliber, then he could have an impact.
Yeah, and it's all about age and fit. And do you look at these guys to be ready to go players like he would be, Quinton Narkle would be, or do you look at DFA as a couple of youngsters who might not have had the opportunities elsewhere, like Caleb Poulter, 2 years in the system, very quickly cut by Magpies, but showed a fair bit in his first year.
He did show a bit, didn't he? He's got some good speed.
And just sort of didn't fit in as much this year with Craig McRae's plan, but he's someone who might. And we have that other window as well in the pre-season supplemental period where the train-on types get their opportunity that way.
What about Connor Blakley? He's a guy with plenty of pace, plenty of size. Kicking is not his strong point, but I've seen that happen a number of times where players change clubs, get to a new skills coach, get better. He's got the body and he's got the physique and he's got the speed that should get him a game, but he couldn't crack it over in the Dockers.
No, and that's right. You mentioned Will Brodie a little bit earlier. Like, someone comes in and takes a spot that was probably the one he would have been eyeing off if he'd not gone there, Brodie. So I think he'd be a player that clubs would be looking at. Clubs also don't want to stack their list with too many inside midfielders. So that's where inside midfielders are finding it hard. And Paddy Dow was on the table ready to be taken anywhere with a year to go on his contract, but couldn't find a spot during the trade period. So there isn't that much movement of those guys.
I think the game is changing that mentality a little bit. A couple of years ago, or probably for about a 6-year period, when the game was so congested, numbers around the contest, you needed the Bulls to win it, the quick hands out or that quick kick out of contest, and then that grind to just contest to contest in terms of the running ability. But now with the game being lengthened a little bit more,
You gotta run.
You got to run. You need speed. You need power. You need.
What did Ross Lyon say when he took over the Saints? He said, "We're runners."
Yeah, exactly right.
And he'll build his plan around the run.
But you've got to have some genuine speed attached to that. And not everyone's going to be the Patrick Dangerfield power and speed or a Ryan Griffin of the past who had that in spades, that endurance, that speed element. But it's more than just the grind now for a midfielder in the competition. And that is something that clubs will now be looking at, particularly with what they draft and moving forward.
Well, just looking at the trade period, I mean, the big three were Taranto, Hopper and Dunkley in terms of the inside midfielders who moved clubs. And then Tom Mitchell had moved for not very much, really, from Hawthorn to Collingwood. O'Meara landed late, another inside midfielder, but one of those sort of players. And Cooper Stevens was one of the others. So it was very few, really.
Yeah, but that's where the inside mid. I think you still need like a Dunkley-Neal combination is going to stand out. Dunkley gets around the ground well. We know that. But he can win it in tight, feeds it out well. Lachie Neale can win both, but he's got some good speed on the outside as well, Lachie Neale. So that's the type of combination you need. A Tom Mitchell, for example, can win the ball and then release to midfielders that actually get out and about a little bit more in some open space.
Well, how good could he be potentially for Nick Dacos, handballer, finding him with a little bit of room?
Even Jordan De Goey. It'd be massive for Jordan De Goey in around the footy because all of a sudden you're giving it to one of the best ball users in their side through the midfield, and it allows Pendlebury to play a bit more of a half back role more consistently behind the play, setting things up. So that's a good recruit for what we're talking about.
One of the texts has come through saying that the clubs are using 7-year deals to cover themselves simply because Tassie have got an open checkbook coming up, and just as the Gold Coast and the Giants did a decade ago. Is it an influence, and do we see the 7-year deal, etc., being, I guess, de rigueur?
We're seeing more and more long-term deals.
Yeah.
I think that it would be part of the planning and part of the thought process. I also think that in stretching it out to 7 years and building in TPP rises and all these type of things, that also gives clubs the ability to shape their cap and have some ability to move it around and move that cash around. And the Tigers, I think, would be able to do that. And we've seen that through the Tom Lynch deal. It's a little bit different in that free agents deal, you've got to stick to what you agree to, but the Dustin Martin one as well. These guys are able to be shifted their cash. So it leaves you actually in a flexible position in a lot of ways to manoeuvre that around. But Tasmania, I think, is having a thought in minds of clubs that are rebuilding via, do we go to the draft really hard over the next couple of years, knowing that in 3 years potentially we're going to lose access to some of these top picks or top kids? Because you look back when those clubs did come in, the Giants and Suns, North Melbourne and Richmond and Essendon were sort of 30% through the rebuild, but then got stuck at 40%, while the better teams like Hawthorn managed to stay at the top because of that gap. So I think that the clubs are thinking more about that from a draft point of view.
Have you given any thought, quickly, Cal, to the way that you think Tassie should be able to enter the competition?
Not heaps as yet, but I feel like there's some lessons from the Giants and Suns, respectively, good and bad.
Kel, you've broken a lot of good stories over the summer. But the one that's been in the paper too much for Essendon supporters is Essendon.
Yeah, they've been a good topic for us in the press, that's for sure. And more news today on that front. They have filled two of their big roles, which were newly created roles. So Dan McPherson, the former footy boss at North Melbourne, he'll take over the head of performance job that they've created at Essendon, and also they've elevated Cam Roberts to be their head of development, which has been a key part of this external review that showed that they need to boost their development stocks, and they basically boosted it by 3 people, essentially, 1 year to the next. So, look, some appointments are being made. There's still a couple to go in terms of that whole club and what it looks like, but they've settled down slightly.
Cam Roberts, this is a big role for Cam, because when we think of development, we think of the 1 to 4 year players in terms of getting them in, getting them settled, develop them in a particular way. I think he needs to set a program for a few groups within the development of the Essendon playing list. So the focus can't be insular into the youngsters coming through. It has to be top end development as well. And I'm talking top end when you look at Zach Merritt and and he's a star, but there's elements of development in his game that need to change and certainly, evolve. And you look through obviously Stringer or Peter Wright. So, and who else we got here? Ridley, who I absolutely love as a defender for Essendon, best and fairest winner. But there's development in him, and that's why I think this role for Cam Roberts it's so important. It's critical across the entire playing group.
Yeah, and they've boosted the ranks beneath him as well. So Brent Stanton's going to be taking on more of a role in that position. Travis Cloak as well. Lee Tudor's going to be a full-time VFL coach. They didn't have a full-time VFL coach last year, so that was part-time. Michael Hurley's going to be involved as well in the development program, and you know how loved he is within that club. And I think he'd be.
But he's
really
aggressive. I like that. He'll be out in the park, and he'll be sort of, you know, obviously doing all this because he hasn't been out there. So all of a sudden he can get out there, hopefully, and obviously do some one-on-one work, get their body positioning better, make them stronger in the contest.
And you talk about the best players. I feel like that's what Brad Scott's going to be really good for too, because I've heard you say as well, Jared, he's got some gravitas to bring to Essendon. I think they needed that in that position. I think he was the appointment that they had to make, and the rest can be filled and these type of things. But I think Brad was the perfect spot for them to take on.
And Travis Auld, I mean, they need to have a big name. To me, they need to settle down that they made a mess of the first one, unfortunately, for the CEO. And so I guess you just have to get the job done. Ultimately, you can build your name. But Travis Auld as an appointment would be a spectacular recovery, I think.
He would. He's been there previously, hasn't he? So he was previously there as part of the leadership group, and then obviously took on the CEO role at the Suns. So much experience at the AFL recently as well, running the broadcasting and the fixture and all these type of things. So, look,
and we know he's in the race for Gill's job, but we've pushed that back 3 to 4 months at least. So he's got a hole to fill in his diary.
Ben Jacobs is the other one as well that's been added to their development program under Brad Scott too. So there is a flavour that he's been able to imprint already within his own coaching group. But so much change at the Bombers. President, CEO, another CEO, coach, head of performance, head of development. I don't think we'll be expecting miracles for what Essendon can produce. I don't think that should be the case either for what they do. They're on the search for a new board member as well, their inaugural First Nations director, and they've sounded out Dean Rioli as one of the potential candidates for that. He's got some interest, so I think we'll see an appointment one way or another on that in the next week or two. So, look, there's been some findings out of the external review, and mainly, though, it came down to basics out of the review. It was around better fitness and improved leadership, boosting the essentials.
Players. Absolutely smashed during the off-season, during the preseason, and that should be the case. These players need to come back, in all honesty, and breaking their own individual records from day one. That's the only way they're going to change the nature of how they're perceived within each other. And it's going to take some of the leaders to do it. It's going to take some youngsters to make the senior players step back and go, whoa, hang on a second. These couple of young players have really set themselves up for a big preseason. That's the element of the playing group side of things. From an off-field point of view, Daniel McPherson, where does it sit in the pecking order in terms of the hierarchy? Because a head of performance, this is a role that is critical. Is that head of performance from a coaching perspective and a playing perspective? Does it encapsulate the whole football department?
I think he's going to align with the coaching panel and where that all sits, and also the fitness, conditioning staff as well, and feed into Josh Marnie. So Josh Marnie will still be the head of the football department. Yep. It's probably just a matter of delegating some of these roles, and of course Sean Murphy as well, who's been their fitness boss. I understand would work in underneath Dan McPherson.
Before you go, we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. Let's run through a few of the clubs that haven't been mentioned. Yep. Carlton. They've picked up a really handy player, which will lead on to my next question. But Blake Acres comes along. Yeah,
for a future third-round pick as well. Not much.
No, they've got him for nothing, which was a fantastic pickup and filled a role that they desperately needed filling. Underrated player. I mean, the halfway mark, he was the number 1 rated wingman in the competition, was on the board at All-Australian level for a little period until he got some hamstring injuries. They've got pick 10 as well. Do you see them potentially top 4?
I do.
Yeah.
I thought they should have been right amongst that this year.
Yeah.
I think they've got all the pillars. I mean, you look at Coleman medalist, Brownlow medalist, a couple of other All-Australians across the past few years.
Young ruckman coming through.
They did have some bad injury luck to some key position players, which we know the back half of the season. So I think they should be aiming for the flag. And there's reasons why. We saw it Collingwood this year, but also Melbourne the year before. Why can't the Blues? I don't see too many holes in that list.
Do they jump the Brisbane Lions, for example, who have recruited Josh Dunkley and Jack Gunston?
You don't want to, John.
That's where it's difficult now, isn't it?
You also don't want to claim someone's won the trade period, because it's usually appointed that they're in for an ordinary year the next year. But Dunkley, for what they did, they'll get Will Ashcroft. get Jasper Fletcher as father-sons and Jack Gunston, as you mentioned, they have it in their hands, don't they? But they've had 4 years of being in the finals and not quite making that step. Maybe this is the one.
I know when people were talking about who won the trade, Andrew Mackie got a big tick, which was fantastic. Melbourne picked up Grundy and Hunter.
Yeah.
I mean, did that go through to the keeper?
Well, it's funny because there's been a lot of focus, and they were desperate to keep Luke Jackson.
Yeah.
And fair enough, too, because he's going to be a superstar. And I honestly believe he will. But in next year, who's going to be the better player for him? If Grundy's at full fitness, they're probably going to be better for having Grundy next year, aren't they? So,
well, especially if the bench goes to 5, it's a perfect recruit.
Yeah, and look, he needs to get back to that fitness to be able to deliver on that. But he was picked 27, and they're not paying all of his salary, clearly. So
that's a good get.
It's a good get.
Serrano and Hopper for the Tigers. Does that re-energise? And Dusty's re-energised himself.
Yeah, my top 4 has about 8 teams in it at the minute,
mine too.
But they're in there.
Well, you look at the top 8. You got Geelong who have traded well, Melbourne who have traded for their needs. The Sydney Swans don't do too much, but they got the youngsters coming through, the best group under 22. The Pies with Mitchell as probably their main inclusion in terms of their midfield. Fremantle have done well getting Jackson. They've lost a couple along the way. Brisbane we spoke about. Richmond who's finished 7th, and the Western Bulldogs get Jones and Rory Lobb. So the top 8 teams have recruited well in the trade period. Then you've got Carlton and Port Adelaide on the outside. So that's where it becomes who do they replace? That the season next year is going to be intriguing because the top clubs are going to be tough to knock off, and any club that can do it through the way to draw, middle 6 or bottom 6, who pops out of those particular draws, it's going to be great to watch.
And I'm really excited about Port Adelaide. I think if they can get their house in order in terms of their lists together and their team together, that midfield of Butters, Rosie, and Horn Francis,
not bad,
with Ollie Wines, the Brownlow medalist, in there as well, and they've really lacked the small. They had so many small forwards a couple of years ago, but now they haven't. That's when they got to get Rioli, and I think he'll flourish under Ken Hinkley.
Fremantle's the one that really interests me. They played some amazing footy. I think they need to play quicker. I think their ball control was found out a fair bit later on in the season, but they lost Akers. They've lost Griffin Lowe. Tucker was in the end just I guess a support player in many ways. He's now at North Melbourne. Rory Lobb's a big loss. Lloyd Meeks, a huge loss as far as depth is concerned.
Yeah.
They've picked up Josh Corbett, who wouldn't, he's going to have to battle away to get a spot. Luke Jackson's a tick, and Jager O'Meara is a tick. But they've also lost Mundy, who's still arguably their second best mid and their best kick inside forward 50.
Absolutely, Jared.
Yeah.
In fact, they haven't got a good kick inside forward 50 outside of Mundy at the moment.
They will miss a few of those players, but I do think that they're on the right track. The overall picture of where they'll be in a couple of years, Fremantle, is still as strong as I thought it would be. And look, I think Corbett can do. They were playing Griffin Logue as a forward. Yeah. I think Corbett can play that role and still kick you 25 to 30 goals. He's probably a more natural forward, really. Rory Lobb was their leading goal kicker. They didn't want to lose. He was contracted, but I feel like they'll be able to get through those.
For me, Freo's success comes off their back 6 again, but in particular their 3 talls down back, who this year were injury-free and played together for the first time, Ryan, Cox and Pearce. So,
and that was part of the reason Griffin Logue had to go forward.
Well, that's right,
Like?
exactly. So they're the 3 players for me. If they remain fit, they can build around that. They've got the run around that with the youngsters and the speed off half back. That's where their game is set up from.
Have you got a surprise coming up for us for the draft? Is there a smoky that you like?
Always got one.
I'm just trying to think of one that I haven't spoken about that's smoky enough for you.
Well, do some work on it.
Hey, here's one he's coming with a rush. I know we've spoken about him a bit though, but interesting story. Ed Allen, he's the son of Ben Allen.
Yep.
So he ran 2.81 at the 20-metre sprint at the combine, 195 centimetre inside midfielder / wingman. 6 months ago was off the radar because he had a back stress fracture. Played in the last sort of 6 or 7 weeks at Claremont for the under 18s.
Have you got his do you know his 2K off the top of your head?
I can find it with you for a second. But
time of the year we're talking about 2Ks.
Exactly. You know what time of the year it is, don't you?
No, because where I'm going is 2.81's elite with speed, but if he's got a bit of endurance to match, all of a sudden that starts to complement what we were talking about earlier.
Yes. He was 6:30.
Pretty good.
Over 2 kilometres.
Yep.
So that's
flying.
That's good. That's good movement.
Cal, great to have you on board, and congratulations. You had a big off season to date, and you're just starting to come into your prime.
Pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me.